Okay, everybody. With the committee's indulgence, I will call the meeting to order. And I'd like to acknowledge that the committee is meeting on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And the first item of business for our meeting is a follow-up presentation from the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General regarding recent amendments to the Special Provincial Constable Complaints and Discipline Regulation. And I'll introduce our guests, but I'll also say that some members have said they might like to ask more broad-ranging questions in the mix at the end of the meeting. I hope that might be all right within whatever you might be prepared for, Mr. Rideout. All right, yeah. That's great to hear. I can't echo it, but it's great to hear. And so our guests are, again, thank you, Mr. Wayne Rideout, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister and Director of Police Services in the Ministry, and Artis Baker, Executive Director, Legislative Initiatives and Policy Accountability, and Corinne Alexander, Program Manager, Municipal Policing Governance and Oversight Division, and Cole Weingarten, Director, Legislation and Policing Programs. So I'm very thankful that you found the time to be able to come back. We have the specific questions around the item at hand, and to get to those, I'd ask you to take it away. It's all yours, Mr. Rideout.
Thank you for having us. Thank you to my team for both preparing me and doing some of the work that you've seen. I believe you have a letter that we sent you late last week that sort of outlines much of what we'll be talking about here today. It's my pleasure to have been invited to the Special Committee to provide information on recent amendments to the Special Provincial Constable Complaints and Discipline Regulation. Special Provincial Constables, or SPCs as they're referred to, are appointed at the discretion of the Minister under Section 9 of the Police Act to perform a variety of peace officer functions. There are approximately 1,350 Special Provincial Constables appointments, and about 400 or 29% are employed within the BC Public Service. Of these, 84%, or approximately 330, are union members. The range of agencies that use Special Provincial Constables are the Legislative Assembly Protective Services, WorkSafe BC, the Justice Institute of BC, Firearms Instructors, Forensic Psychiatric Hospital Security Officers, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty of Animals, RCMP Support Personnel, Metro Vancouver Transit Police Support Personnel, a limited number of external law enforcement agencies that do work in BC on short-term basis receive temporary Special Provincial Constable status through my office. The following three Crown agencies, which include the BC Securities Commission, the Insurance Corporation of BC, and the Financial Services Authority. 13 compliance and enforcement units across 8 ministries, including the Conservation Officer Service in the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, the Audits and Investigations Branch, Ministry of Health, the Intersection Safety Camera Unit in Road Safety BC, and the Enforcement Division within the Gaming Policy and Enforcement Branch of the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General. I'm going to call them SPC just because it rolls off my tongue a little easier. SPC appointments are an adjunct appointment to an individual's primary employment appointment. For example, public service employees are appointed under the Public Service Act prior to being appointed as SPCs. And SPCs who hold unionized positions also have their employment relationship governed by the applicable collective agreement. An SPC appointment permits the appointee to exercise the powers and immunities of a provincial constable that are necessary to carry out their ordinary job functions. The SPC appointments are also subject to the restrictions specified in those appointments, the regulations, and the common law. Generally speaking, someone who holds an SPC appointment will only need the powers and immunities it provides when fulfilling specific tasks, and these tasks do not make up the majority of their employment-related duties. For SPCs such as ministry investigators, the SPC appointment may authorize them to obtain a search warrant under the Offence Act, lay charges under any provincial statute, obtain judicial authorizations, serve a promise to appear, conduct surveillance with a warrant, and be an agent for the Crown. If policing and law enforcement services are viewed as law enforcement continuum, SPCs would fall in the middle due to the limited nature of the appointment. This continuum is very nuanced, but the following is a high-level summary. At the beginning of the law enforcement continuum, you will find police officers, including RCMP officers, municipal police officers, and officers of designated policing units such as the Metro Transit Police. Police officers occupy the independent office of the Constable and in that regard are unique from peace officers who have limited law enforcement functions. The common law has created 4 principal duties of police officers: the duty to preserve the peace and prevent crime, the duty to enforce the law, the duty to preserve life, protect against serious injury, and protect property, and the duty to execute warrants. These common law duties have been codified provincially in the Police Act and federally in the RCMP Act. After police officers, there are designated law enforcement units under the Police Act. These officers have peace officer status and can be authorized to enforce specific laws, but do not necessarily do so. For example, the designated law enforcement unit that is part of the Organized Crime Agency of BC provides supplemental support to police. There are 3 special provincial constables under the Police Act. As I have noted, this is an adjunct appointment to the individual's primary employment appointment and is made to provide the peace officer powers and immunities that are necessary to enable the individual to effectively carry out their ordinary job functions. An appointee is only able to exercise SPC authority when on duty and in the performance of their ordinary job functions. For example, a gaming investigator with an SPC appointment will not be authorized to investigate offences under the taxation statutes or offences under the Motor Vehicles Act, because that is not within their SPC authority. Next on the continuum, there are statutory enforcement officers, primarily provincial employees, who enforce a variety of statutes. Their law enforcement authorities come from a specific statute or multiple statute and is limited to the enforcement of the applicable statute. For example, community safety officers under the Cannabis Control and Licensing Act, commercial vehicle safety and enforcement officers under the Motor Vehicle Act, Commercial Transport Act, and other statutes, BC correction staff and probation officers under the Corrections Act, sheriffs under the Sheriff's Act, and municipal bylaw enforcement officers under the Community Charter. These individuals are common law peace officers when exercising their statutory enforcement powers. They may hold SPC appointments to enable them to exercise the powers and immunities of a provincial constable that are necessary to carry out their ordinary job functions. Next on the continuum are auxiliary police officers and special municipal constables. These officers and constables provide a support role to regular police officers, such as assisting with traffic control or large community events. Auxiliary officers are volunteers, while special municipal constables are paid. Some special constables are like SPCs in the appointment, as in that this appointment is adjunct to the individual's primary employment duties. For example, support personnel within municipal agencies. Moving on, I'd like to go over the reasons for the Special Provincial Constable Complaints and Discipline and Regulation change in June 22 to the regulation change. In June 2020, the BC Court of Appeal decision, Cassavant versus British Columbia, through the Labour Relations Board, created uncertainty for the ministry regarding the scope of matters that are admissible under the regulation. The decision held that complaints and discipline involving the exercise of a SPC's constabulary duties or powers must proceed under the regulation. The court maintained that in terms of disciplining an employee holding an SPC appointment, there is a distinction between employment-related conduct and constabulary conduct. And it is only the latter, the constabulary conduct, that is subject to the processes set out in the regulation. As a result of that uncertainty, the Ministry amended the regulation as minimally as possible while the committee's work was ongoing to ensure that the regulation reflected the Ministry's policy intention. For instance, first, the regulation was amended to limit its application to complaints made by a member of the public or someone acting on behalf of that person if the member of the public is incapable of doing so due to their age or mental or physical condition. The issue of whether the regulation applies to public complaints as opposed to matters of internal discipline of SPCs was not raised before the Court of Appeal. Ministry policy and practice had been and continues to be to limit the regulation to public complaints. However, the wording of the previous regulation was not clear on this point, so the regulation was amended to provide the needed clarity. Second, the regulation was amended to clarify the type of conduct that is subject to the processes under the regulation. By explicitly stating that the regulation applies only to the conduct of an SPC that is constabulary in nature, the common law recognizes that while the regulation applies to SPCs in relation to complaints about the manner in which they carry out their SPC duties, nothing in the regulation of the Police Act immunizes SPCs from other disciplinary processes for misconduct that is unrelated to SPC duties. However, the regulation was not clear whether it applied to all conduct of a person holding an SPC appointment or only the conduct related to the performance of a constabulary duty. This lack of clarity in the regulation created ambiguity about how employers should address concerns with employees who are SPCs when the conduct of concern is not constabulary in nature. I understand that the Special Committee is seeking clarity on the material impact of those changes in terms of the union processes. While I will not comment on labor relations matter, I can provide the following. The Public Service Act does not apply to SPCs because Section 6 of the Police Act specifically disapplies it. However, the common law has recognized that the Public Service Act applies to regular employee matters for individuals who hold SPC appointments. This means that in the context of disciplinary proceedings for special provincial constables who are provincial government employees, the Public Service Act has limited application to matters of discipline. Additionally, labor unions, including the BC General Employees Union, do not have legal standing in the complaint process under the regulation. The BCGEU wrote to the Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General on January 20th, 2021, and presented before this committee on February 26, 2021, to request that the SPC regulation be amended to permit labor relations dispute resolution process to apply to discipline under the regulation. Specifically, the BCGEU requested that Section 8 of the regulation be amended to require that any challenge to a supervised decision to impose a corrective or disciplinary measure must be brought forward by a members' union under the applicable collective agreement. While this amendment was requested, it was not made given that it would be a significant change to the regulation and the Ministry did not want to substantially alter the regulation while the Special Committee was conducting its review. It should be noted that the regulation does not prevent the BCGEU from supporting its members in an informal capacity during an investigation under the regulation. Due to the ambiguity within the regulation and the uncertainty raised by the Cassavant decision, narrow amendments were made, as I mentioned previously. To clarify that regulation only applies in the case of public complaints and only to conduct involving the exercise of constabulary duty authorized under the SPC appointment. These narrow amendments reflect the Ministry's policy intent and are an interim measure while the work of the Special Committee is underway to reduce ambiguity and prevent the potential significant increase in the volume of complaints related to regular employee matters. Specifically, the amended regulation clarifies that only members of the public may make a complaint under the regulation, clarifies that nothing in the regulation limits or prohibits an employer from disciplining an employee who holds an SPC appointment if the conduct at issue does not relate to the performance of its constabulary duties, clarifies that constabulary duties are those specified in the relevant SBC appointment, not duties performed under legislation other than the Police Act or specified in any other agreement such as general employment agreement. Empowers the Director of Police Services to determine whether a complaint is admissible under the regulation, a function that was previously fulfilled by the Special Provincial Constable Supervisor. The rationale for this decision is that the Director of Police Service is the best position to determine if the conduct in question is constabulary or not. While narrow amendments are made to the regulation, there is an opportunity to make broader policy changes. For example, the regulation only applies to public complaints, so there remains a lack of clarity about how a special provincial constable is to be disciplined for constabulary conduct that is not subject to a public complaint. There may be additional opportunities for improving oversight that the special committee identifies, and I look forward to the committee's report and recommendations. As a final point, I'd like to highlight that the public complaints related to conduct in special provincial constables in the province constabulary duties are rare. There have been 11 complaints in the past 6 years. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee and provide clarification on the special provincial constable complaints and discipline regulation, and myself and my team are happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Members, questions? Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Rideout, for your for the letter and for your presentation this evening. Thank you for extending your day for us, for the committee. I really appreciate it. I'm understanding on page 6 under the specifically the amended regulation and then I think the fourth point. If I understood the part of the challenge that we faced was that there was a sort of a conflict between the constabulary duty and union discipline in terms of who can enforce that or who can discipline a member of a union and as well someone who has those constabulary duties. And previously it was left to the union, the supervisor of that, and maybe not the union, but it was left to the supervisor. Now that's been moved to your role, Director of Police Services, to the Director of Police Services, and that sort of clarifies, takes it out of house, I guess.
Yes, Emily, I think what it does is it provides a degree of independence into the decision making. So the supervisor still has the authority to do any discipline with respect to their non-constabulary duties, anything with their general employment. But when the matter becomes a product, if you will, of police type work within that responsibility, that narrow slice of their daily duties, the new regulation makes that decision mine as far as whether it is within the domain of a constabulary duty or not. And I think that for many supervisors, that's a very nebulous area to try to understand whether the duties that are being, the specific facts of the duties surrounding the complaint were in fact a law enforcement or a police constabulary duty.
Sorry, I'm going to just, so if I may continue with, can you, Mr. Rideout, can you provide, I guess, using maybe 2 examples? We've got the Legislative Protective Services here, which fall under this in this situation, as well as the Conservation Service. Can you maybe outline in the letter here? It says that they are first employees of and members of the union, and then they've got this constabulary duties as kind of an auxiliary to their role. Can you explain how that plays out here, for an example, where we've got Legislative Protective Services, or even on the ground out in rural BC, where you've got special constables? Seems like they're, conservation officers. It seems like that is the primary role, is to provide those constabulary services. Can you maybe just highlight the distinction here?
Certainly. So I think when it comes to the protective detail here, it's difficult for me to fully understand what they do day in and day out, but it strikes me that they do a lot of security. They do a lot of security type work for the grounds of Legislative Assembly. But at times, the work that they do would cross over into the specifics of the special provincial constable authorities that they've been provided within their appointments. If they're perhaps not showing up for work on an ongoing basis, or they're not writing reports properly pursuant to their employment, or any number of things that can happen in your general employment, that would fall under the conditions of their employment under their Public Service Act agreements. However, if they engaged in the specific functions of their appointment, in this case, making arrests, or perhaps anything from a law enforcement function that fell outside of that and that became a discipline process, it would be difficult for a supervisor to make a determination if it was squarely within a breach of the specific authorities they had, and under the new regulations, the facts of that would come to our office, and we would make a determination if it should in fact be a discipline process under the Public Service Act or under the regulations. And perhaps my colleagues might be able to give you some examples of what their specific authorities would be with respect to the protective details, even a few.
Can you speak to conservation?
Okay.
Yeah. The Conservation Officer Service, primarily, their appointment is for exigent circumstances. So they have their regular conservation officer duties, Wildlife Act, Environmental Management Act. That's the primary function that they perform. And then their SPC appointment is for exigent circumstances primarily, which means those circumstances where a delay in taking enforcement action would result in danger to human life or safety, or where the enforcement action is necessary to prevent the continuation of offense which threatens human life or safety. So, for instance, if a conservation officer was out on patrol doing their regular conservation officer duties, and say they came across a hunting party and there was an assault taking place, it would be appropriate for them to step in, and they have the authority to step in as if they were police, because you have to appreciate that police could be an hour and a half away.
One more question. I appreciate the distinction and that clarity. I really appreciate these responses. Just one, we have a situation where these are individuals that are carrying guns and have weapons and have training on those weapons. To a member of the public, it would appear that they are performing the constabulary duty at all times because they are carrying weapons, and they've been given the ability to discharge those weapons, not without oversight, but or without consequence, I should say, but they have the ability to do that. Can you maybe just further add to the distinction? Because I think to the public it appears that while the letter of what their duties are might have a distinction, it doesn't appear to be distinct.
Well, I think though, Emily, they're trained in before they sort of get access to the use of force weapons and follow the standards that exist in the province for those. But there are many circumstances in their daily duties where those firearms or those use of force options are available for them for their self-protection. And in this case, I would say exigent circumstances in which perhaps a conservation officer is a very good example in a remote area, and comes across a hunting party, perhaps they're drinking and things get out of control. It's there for their protection. And while I concur with you that the outward appearance for some of these individuals is that they are police, they are not police in the broader sense of the term, and they're only authorized to sort of operate in that space in a very limited way.
But because of the way that it's defined, at any moment they could act in their constabulary role based on their own discretion at that moment to determine whether or not. Is that right?
Well, they're not, the wording is not the same for all of them, and I think what we just heard around conservation service is an example that, often when you're conducting investigations in certain spaces, the action does not need to be taken immediately. The investigations are conducted over time, evidence is gathered, trends are observed, a lot of it is disruption, it is prevention. So the exigent circumstances really are not something that is sort of activated on a daily basis. Some of the other groups that we talked about, and there's many, their special provincial constable status would be used quite rarely. In other words, seeking a warrant or swearing in information would be something that they would do probably very infrequently.
Thank you. Go ahead, Gary.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for the presentation. I wonder if there is an opportunity to clean up the regulations, and it keys into something that Adam said that I hadn't thought of before. Exigent circumstances that rarely arise, but we have policemen, for example, fully trained policemen, who don't arrest people or don't ever hit the road. Could we clean it up by perhaps everyone who has a badge and a gun, for example, would be covered in those circumstances? Because we don't make a distinction between a police officer who doesn't arrest people because that's not his job. He's a staffing officer or whatever. I just, would it be helpful, I know I'm asking you for an opinion, but could we clean it up so that it's very clear that if you're in northern BC where Dan is and you're a conservation officer, I know they do it in Alberta, you brought that to my attention, they actually work with the RCMP. So is there a way that we could clean it up so that there isn't that ambiguity that in my mind still remains?
Thanks for your question, Emily. I think there is some opportunity. I think when you'll recall when we testified, our branch testified, gave a presentation to you on a couple of occasions. We talked about a policing and public safety continuum. We talked about an idea that was trying to force multiply public safety through a wide spectrum of resources and leveraging resources to do different functions, not always requiring the fully trained police officer for a lot of functions that are there. And I think that continues to be an option. I think we need to be also, if I could say, mindful of what we see in the United States, where everybody's out there carrying a gun and conducting law enforcement, and we do have to limit that to a large degree, because that becomes a very challenging model to control at the provincial level, where you've got people out doing all kinds of, perhaps not trained and or experienced in certain kinds of investigations and or interdictions, enforcement action. So trying to find that balance would be challenging. But I think that there are opportunities to look at where perhaps there are bans and or limits, and then empower special provincial constables within those bans. I would not be a real fan of that being limitless. I think that, we know that, for example, we hire people to work in a number of areas that really are experts in perhaps money laundering or financial matters, and we really want to make sure that we don't ever put them in circumstances in which they will perhaps find themselves in difficult, challenging situations. So I know that's a bit of a roundabout question. I think there are opportunities to both clean it up and to leverage it, frankly.
Thank you. We've talked and we continue to talk about tiered policing. In other words, uniformed members who perform specialized policing functions. Is that one of the things that...
I think it is, and I think, we are about to hear Mr. Justice Cullen come back in May with his recommendations, and I think that's a really good example of when, you know, we talk about the ability of this province and all the provinces in Canada to have expertise, sustainable expertise in key areas like money laundering, like financial crime. Hiring a police officer or utilizing an RCMP officer who is trained to do a multitude of different functions is, the return on investment of that is not good. They transfer, they move on, and we start again, we train again, we start again. So the idea that we can create some sustainable expertise in key and specialized areas, get, you know, and people do that for many, many years, they grow, they train, they evolve, is really an excellent way of proceeding. One of the things that the branch has been doing is working within the OCA-BC environment. So you'll know that OCA-BC is a subsidiary, a subset group of CFSU BC in the organized crime space. But it is a standalone agency that works with and is integrated with the RCMP CFSU. But a lot of our provincial investments around gangs and guns and other specialized services like our firearms tracing lab and some of the work we do around tracking, we've put in the investments into OCA-BC because we can hire exactly what you're talking about. We hire people with specific skills and expertise and experience, and they're not subject to transfer and moving around the province. So again, a long answer, but yes.
That's good. Thanks.
Thank you. And I've got Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks again for the presentation, all of you. As Gary said, you know, when I first got onto this committee, I was overwhelmed with the number of people that are peace officers, especially. I mean, I had no idea that there was that many people that actually had that designation. So certainly the cleaning up aspect and you know, if the opportunity of tightening it up a little bit, I think certainly is a good idea. Two questions. One is you talked about special peace officer, I guess it was designation that's given from time to time to, like you made it sound like, you know, they're not in this list, but it gives you the authority to give that to someone. What are those examples? Like, what would that be?
A really good example is perhaps the City of Calgary Police. Perhaps they're investigating a homicide that happened in the City of Calgary, but suspects and witnesses are in British Columbia. So they, unlike the RCMP, they don't have a national authority. They only operate in the province of Alberta under the Alberta Act. So in order to operate as peace officers here, they have to be given temporary special provincial constable status, which we do based on the request, the fact pattern, the authorization of their chief, and that's what primarily it's for.
And that would be the same case if overseas or anything like that as well, or is that just within Canada that can you give that authority?
We would not be giving overseas, nor even people like our American colleagues who operate in Canada. Often they don't get the same status. That's for Canadian jurisdictions. When we operate, when the RCMP operates abroad, it operates under sort of agreements with foreign countries, and it's more of a observer. They operate almost as observers. They really have no legal authorities.
Okay. You talk about the designated law enforcement units, the special constables, and then you start the statutory enforcement officers, and you have them listed. Specifically the commercial vehicle safety and the sheriffs. They have, or do they have the full, I guess, I'm just looking at these other pieces, and I just wonder where they kind of fit in, because I almost put them, you know, at that, you know, and I think the average, like Adam kind of alluded to, you see someone in a uniform and they've got, you know, handcuffs and everything else, you automatically categorize them as a peace officer fulfilling a policing role. So you pull them as statutory enforcement officer. I'm just wondering why they're so separate as sheriffs who are, you know, detaining people, and CVSE obviously to a lesser extent, but still, you know, the ability to pull vehicles over and to engage almost police-like. I'm just curious about how that got like that.
The CVSE is an interesting one in that, of course, we've seen a lot of convoy protests in recent weeks and months, and which brought with it the threat of these big rigs. And you know, we looked at, you know, options as to, you know, enforcement, and they're really not there. The powers that are afforded the
CVSE.
I get it wrong every time, are very limited to the inspections, and the work enforcement can be done under, I believe it's 3 acts, and it's squarely in there, and they're not really, they really truly are not what we would largely see and view as police officers. They're not trained to that extent. They're not really, they haven't been hired. They have no real expectations that are going to be in confrontations with people, as one example. And it's a very specific space. They need that status in order to do some of the specific work they do, but it's not broad. Same with the sheriffs. The sheriffs have very limited authorities. And even, it is very rare that you'll see a sheriff's vehicle even use a blue or red light on a car. That their ability to engage in what we call emergency vehicle operations is extremely limited.
Just a follow-up to that last comment, and yeah, interesting, during the floods this summer, or this past summer, CVSEs were used to control traffic, and I understand there were some issues. People basically saying, you have no authority to stop me. And they were right. They did not have that. Was there anything done as a result of some of those complaints that happened this summer? And or how does one fix that? What's your ability in the ministry to fix that on the fly? Because that was obviously something that was extreme. Is there that ability to add, powers to these other categories?
I have no ability, but when in those instances, the state of emergencies were declared, and they then have authorities that come with the state of emergencies, both with the COVID enforcement and then floods and fires. And when there's states of emergencies, there's sort of other pieces that go into play. From a strategy, from a pragmatic perspective, what the ministry does with its policing partners and with MOTI and the other ministries is looks to kind of force multiply and leverage. So CVSE and the Ministry of Transport were on those locations, but we'd also have RCMP Highway Patrol there as well to try to again force multiply. So they work very effectively at traffic control and routing vehicles and getting them through and all the rest of it. We were very fortunate. Yes, there was some of that, but there was also a tremendous amount of cooperation from the general public. There is really not much power that we have to enhance anybody's authority in a rapid way. In cases such as you described, fires, floods, COVID, states of emergency give additional, and my colleagues here were very heavily engaged in some of those modifications and enforcement powers under states of emergency. So the strategy has traditionally been to seek public cooperation and limit enforcement, and actually we're really quite successful with not having to do much enforcement at all. I know that's not your question, but they're not well positioned to be on the front lines, and that doesn't mean they're not highly skilled, capable professionals, but that's not their function, that's not what they were hired for, that's not what they're trained to do.
Good, thanks.
Okay, members, anybody else on the letter and the subject at hand? I think we might have a few other questions. Gary, I think do you have it?
So, you're a retired assistant commissioner to the RCMP. Can we stray a bit into your observations over the years? This committee, of course, is looking at, broadly speaking...
if we could just wait for a minute.
Yep.
This meeting is a public meeting.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we're looking at is obviously the delivery of policing services in British Columbia, and our ability to impact or affect the delivery of that service. And we've heard evidence and taken testimony from people who are concerned about how cumbersome that becomes at times because of the national implications for the RCMP. And I wonder if you have any comments or observations that you would make based upon your experience about what we would call nimbleness. You've alluded to some of them in your previous statement about transfer of talent, that kind of thing. That's come up several times on this committee, and I wonder if you would be inclined or would feel comfortable making a general comment about how we can best impact the delivery of police services in British Columbia to British Columbians.
Certainly, I'd be happy to. As you said, MLA, I spent 34 and a half years in the RCMP. I joined the RCMP when I was 19 years old, and it's been my life. Last 6 years, I've worked for the Ministry of Public Safety and the Policing Security branch, so I've had the benefit of sort of seeing it's like a broader, more strategic view of things. In my view, as far as the men and women in the RCMP on the street, exceptional. Exceptional police officers, exceptionally trained, exceptionally recruited, very, very capable. Their investigative capacity, their ability to deliver successful results on complex investigations is second to none. So I differentiate between policing and the business of policing. I think British Columbia deserves to have more control of its own public safety destiny. And within the current contractual arrangement, one that will expire in 2032, we are limited within that destiny based on the agreement and the confines of that agreement. And the RCMP national headquarters, which I differ from the provincial headquarters, and the relationship with Public Safety Canada and the contractual obligations. We benefit from that arrangement. Municipally, 10% contribution comes from Canada, provincially 30%. So there is a financial benefit that is significant on a $500 million provincial policing budget. That's a lot of money. But it limits us. Cost, that 30% comes at a cost, in my view. I'm giving you my personal opinion now, not my... I think that British Columbia should strive to better control its own public safety destiny in the future. And there's multiple ways to do that. Not the least of which is to strongly encourage the RCMP itself to evolve to better meet province's needs rather than, if you will, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But it's not sustainable in its current form. The world is evolving, expectations are evolving, the crime is evolving, violence is evolving, judicial requirements are evolving, and the model is not sustainable. You may also be aware that the Federal Minister of Public Safety's mandate letter from the government indicates a review of contract policing in Canada. That came this year, and what that will entail is yet to be determined. But it seems to me that Canada itself is looking at whether it wants to be in the business of contract policing, and we need to be alive to that. Because it seems to suggest that it itself recognizes the need to modernize. When I say contract policing, that is the service provided to provincial and territories, not the federal overlap service. All policing is complicated. Independent municipal policing is complicated, and multiple police departments within geographical boundaries is complicated as well. So, you know, replacing all municipal RCMP with independent police departments has got a whole host of its own problems as well. But I believe that, you know, those that follow me and the Minister of Public Safety should be able to evolve the most significant policing presence in the province in a way that's consistent with the expectations of British Columbia, and not have to negotiate with Canada and others to make that happen.
Could I ask one more question?
Yes.
It's related. We've struggled as well with metrics or measurement tools or how you assess policing. How do we know that we're being policed at an adequate level? And one of the areas surrounds specialty units. We're not only concerned about the metrics, but we're concerned about the oversight or lack of oversight, for example, of CFSEU or Gang Task Force or IHIT or agencies that evolve or devolve the policing system into a sort of a patchwork quilt of the provision of police services over boundaries, city boundaries, that kind of thing. So what do you suggest would be a way that part of the provincial police program should include accountability, measurement tools by which their performance and strength can be measured? Do those tools exist? The example that I think of course, is Gang Task Force or IHIT. Do we know how successful IHIT is? Do we know how successful Gang Task Force is? Is it reasonable to expect that if you have a gang task force that gangster activity dissipates and it's measurable? Or what are the metrics that could be applied to policing?
Thanks, Emily. The branch has done some really interesting leading edge work in this area, so I'm really glad you asked the question. And I think, as you heard me say in the last question, I distinguish between the BC RCMP and the national RCMP, because the BC RCMP have been very cooperative in our efforts to achieve and obtain what I would call return on investment metrics and or socio-economic return on investment metrics. And this is an area of work that we've undertaken in the organized crime space, and now we're expanding out across the province. And again, I have to point out that the BCRCMP have been very supportive of this work. So I think what we need to do when we assign our annual delegations to the RCMP, financial delegations, we send with it performance metrics, expectations on reporting and achieving. But the idea that we're measuring how many guns are seized or how much cocaine has been seized in the locker really is becoming less and less of an indicator. What we're looking to measure in a meaningful way is, does that effort or that project or that work of CFSU over the course of a 6-month period against a particular, say, the Lower Mainland gang conflict, does that financial investment and the unit that is there, is it having a demonstrable difference to the problem? When we look at policing and costs, we have done some really interesting research, and we can give you the numbers for a seized organized crime dollar. So if we seize $1 of organized crime money, say we go into a house and we seize $100,000, we know when we've done studies that is the relative return on investment, the crime prevention value of that seizure is 11 to 1, approximately. We know that if we seize an illegal gun, not just any gun, but a gun that's desired by gangsters, we do that through proactive work, that the return on investment for that seizure, so the investment in policing dollars may be, say, $100,000 in totality. But we know that seizing that gun that will be used 11 times approximately before it's used in a murder or an act of violence prevents the socioeconomic cost to society of hospitalizations, people out of work, court costs, hospital costs, grief costs, and it goes on exponentially. So we need to begin to evaluate and monitor and assign policing and public safety dollars, not all that different than health does it when they allocate funds. We are looking for, are people healthier? Are they safer? Are people, for example, certain types of illnesses, are they being reduced by the efforts that we are causing to occur as opposed to being reactive, and that we've got a collective and total plan in place as to how to if you will, combat the problem at hand. So financial delegations go out, there's a plan in place, and then we measure it, but not sporadic, meaningless metrics, but real results as to whether that societal problem has been impacted. Equally, I think we have to be more accountable to the police. We ask the police to do an awful lot in society. Court decision after court decision after court decision changes the requirements of policing and law enforcement, but we don't give the police any more money or people. Hospitals close, more people on the streets for mental health and addictions, homelessness, coexisting, all of those issues on the street, causing more downstream impacts on policing, and we give them nothing. It doesn't work. What you're doing when those issues hit, when you take them away from proactive, preventative, strategic, intelligence-led work and be reactive to these societal problems or judicial decisions, they're not getting ahead of the problem, they're chasing it. And for multiple generations on the health front, the police are chasing those issues. I'm not saying it's not important, it's critically important. And people's wellness and community safety, community perception, all of it is critical. But it's not part of a strategic plan. We do not fund the police. In fact, we've just gone through 2 years of sort of a model of defund the police. But it will not work. It will not work without the other enablers being raised at the same time. And I fear that, we tend to always want to solve these problems through policing, and it's not going to happen. So, again, another long-winded, I apologize, response, but it's very complicated. We need to have a strategic plan for policing. We need to have performance metrics. This branch has done some tremendous work on performance metrics. We have very innovative, and to be fair, the police are working with us on that, and they've embraced it. It's baby steps and it's slow, it's hard slugging, but we're getting there. Because a lot of the systems that are established, at least within the bigger departments, are not really designed to automatically capture that. So a lot of it's manual. So, IT systems and reporting and has to meet that. So when you're establishing performance metrics, their systems have to meet it in order to perform it. Also easier done with a provincial force than, say, the RCMP. But we need to do a better job around meeting the needs of police. And, the police traditionally, historically, through my career and even today, I watch them be tasked with one thing after another, after another, after another. And the police are very good at going out and getting the job done. But they're losing ground. They're losing ground because everything has gotten way more complicated than it used to be. And when you talk about police oversight, absolutely. Effective policing needs effective police governance. That means effective police boards. We've got a lot of work to do around police boards and police board governance. Around effective oversight bodies. The RCMP is the CRCC and the OPCC. We have them. But it also, it requires sort of an understanding of policing and public safety within the broader community health and wellness context. And I think often they're just sort of left out of the conversation, and they sit there and kind of have to deal with whatever people decide in a whole bunch of other decisions, and now everyone's scrambling to figure it out.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for the presentation. And you have touched upon quite a few of things that I was going to talk about, but we as a committee have been hearing from people for almost 15 months now, and now in the deliberation mode. Issues that first we thought whether they exist, now we know that they are of the colonial systems that we have, and policing is not immune to that. And one issue that has come over and over again is the systemic racism. And we have heard from people that how policing is not working for them. And not just today, it has not worked for them in generations. And I'm sure the staff has been following the conversations very closely.
Yeah.
lot is expected from this committee because it's a historic movement for us to bring in the change that many, especially the marginalized communities, are looking for. What do you see? Like, obviously, we as committee will be doing our deliberations and our recommendations, but what do you see, like, for policing to work for everybody, not just for few people, but for every British Columbian having equal right to policing, justice, and equality?
Well, it's critical. That's the basic premise of policing and always has been. I think what's unfortunately happened is policing has, for a variety of reasons, lost the confidence of our community in some of these areas. The idea that systemic racism, doesn't exist in policing is completely wrong. Of course it does. It exists in every element of our organizations and society. So I think it's there. I think what needs to take place is and I'm hoping, like many of my colleagues, that the work of this committee, as you say, will be historic, will be transformational, and provide the enablers for change. So when we talk about things like systemic racism, public confidence in policing on a broader, you're absolutely correct that everybody should be able to call the police and not fear and not be worried and have trust. And this is critically important. I think that many of the things we've talked about this evening and before are what I would describe as enablers for us to get there. There's certain things that have to be fixed in policing and in the Police Act. We know that there's many recommendations that we would probably, would look to hope to make in the Police Act if that comes to fruition. This is not just an opportunity. It's probably the only opportunity in certainly in the time I've been visible to such things and looking forward to make those types of changes. And I think we're all optimistic, hopeful, and that this is the time. I don't pretend to have all the answers on how we can affect that change. I think that the police leadership people that I work with and my team works with every day will embrace the recommendations and they will do their very best to make change. My guess is, I'm sure guess is not what a committee wants to hear, but it's going to take some time. It's not the kind of change that's going to happen overnight. And I think what we do, or what you'll do, is set certain principles and expectations. And as leadership evolves, and as departments evolve, as unions evolve, and as the next generation sort of emerges into those leadership roles, they will only emerge into those leadership roles if they embrace those concepts, because they cannot be successful as the next chief or the next inspector or the next assistant commissioner unless they do, walk the talk. I don't think we're going to flip a switch and it's going to happen overnight.
Really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rashna. Go ahead, Dan.
This has been very valuable. I appreciate the conversation. Embarrassingly, I have not looked at the mandate letter to the federal minister, which I've just pulled up now and read it. There's a lot of interesting little tidbits in there that I didn't know was happening. But the one that you brought up was about assessing contract policing with the provinces. Has there been any, and I understand it's not even been a year yet, but has there been any discussion? Has the federal government reached out? Has there been any engagement at all to this point regarding what contracting may look like moving down the road?
The short answer, and I'm not prone to short, as you've probably already detected, is very little. I think even at the national level, they're trying to figure out what that means. But I do think it is a signal and something from a provincial level we should be mindful of. This province is more heavily invested in contract policing than any other province in the country. We are reliant on it. And, we should be at least eyes wide open for the future. There's a couple of other converging factors, and I think we provided some additional submissions to the committee. In addition, since we last spoke, in addition to that item with a review of contract policing, and in this province, I believe there's about 6,500 RCMP officers. All but about 1,000 of those are contract policing. whether it be municipal or provincial resources. So it is a sizable presence here that will be pursuant to that contract. The other piece that's critically important when you look at the future of policing in this province and the impacts of policing in this province is the fact that the RCMP has become unionized since we were last with you and the collective agreement has been signed. RCMP officers have rightly received relative parity with their municipal counterparts. It's not exact parity, but they were way behind for years and years and years. That raises the cost significantly both for the province and the municipal participants. So that cost is, at a 70% split, goes downstream to anybody contracting the RCMP. So that is another factor when you look forward and you say, oh, well, if you're the city of, any city and your costs were X under the old agreement, you now have to at least consider. And it was inevitable, and the cities all knew it, but RCMP officers are now getting paid closer to what their municipal counterparts are. As such, policing costs just went up in your city. The average is about 21% for a constable increase. But we have to be mindful of the fact that that is just the first collective agreement. More to come. So between now and 2032, the RCMP and the National Police Federation will conduct negotiations with Canada, and we expect that the first agreement was pretty much squarely dealt with pay parity. We will see some future cost parity around senior ranks, which are grossly disproportionate at this point. It has been a challenge for the RCMP to maintain its ranks because these officers leave and go to other departments. But in future agreements, we should expect to see more focus by the union, rightly so, on member wellness, member health, areas in which we will see changes to how many officers can be in a detachment at a time. So detachments that in this province perhaps are policed by 2 or 3 officers may require 4 or 5 in order to meet the union agreement. This will also increase policing costs provincially, not so much municipally. We will see certain functions that are covered under the current contract may not be covered in future contracts because they're no longer deemed to be something that Canada wishes to participate in. And I talk about like integrated teams. We enjoy the benefit of that 30% contribution for integrated teams in this province. There's no guarantees that that will be maintained. It may well, but we don't know. But there are a number of challenges and uncertainties on the horizon. Where is Canada going with contract policing? What will these union agreements mean for communities that rely on the RCMP now? And will that 30% contribution offset, the pros and cons that come with that? I think in many cases it will, because when it gets to rural policing, it's a very challenging environment to provide a provincial service for. But we have seen, a shift in the last year with that focus on Canada and with that union. Benefits will come. When we talk about member wellness and health and benefits, that's also a positive, because we have, high numbers of officers off with illness and stress and PTSD. So those things need to be factored in, but it will change policing in the future.
Members, any more questions? We ask such small questions. Big questions and great answers. So it's been very valuable to have your reflections and the information that you brought to us, but also this opportunity for people to, I think, tie up a lot of ends here. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. I'm really looking forward to the 28th, I believe it is.
Yes. Pardon me?
Recess.
Yes, and with many thanks on behalf of the committee members, we will now take a recess. The committee, thank you. All right, I'll call the meeting back to order, and we've got the documents in front of us here.
Motion to go in camera.
Oh, yes, thank you. And ask for a motion to go in camera from Gary, seconded by Adam. All in favor and opposed? the public. And now, could someone give me a motion to adjourn the meeting, please? Dan, and seconded by Rachna, all in favor? Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone.